The wind howled through the empty plains as John Mercer rode along the edge of his land, the dust kicking up under his horse's hooves. He was a man who kept to himself, a rancher with more ghosts than friends. That's when he saw it, a shadow swaying in the distance. As he got closer, his stomach twisted. A boy, no older than 12, hung from a mesquite tree, a rough wooden sign around his neck, "White man don't forgive." The rope creaked, but the boy's chest still rose, barely. John didn't hesitate. He pulled out his knife and cut him down. The child gasped, his dark eyes wide with terror. "Easy now," John muttered, catching him before he hit the ground. He didn't know who'd done this, but one thing was certain, this wasn't just cruelty. It was a message. And John Mercer had just stepped into the middle of it. The boy's breath came in shallow rasps as John carried him into the ranch house, his small frame trembling under the rough wool blanket. The firelight flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of things better left unsaid. John had seen wounds before, knife cuts, broken bones, even a snake bite once, but this was different. The boy's wrists were raw from the rope, his lips cracked from thirst, but the worst of it wasn't the marks on his body. It was the way his eyes darted to the door every few seconds, like he expected the devil himself to come crashing through. John soaked a cloth in water and pressed it to the boy's forehead. "You're safe here," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The boy flinched but didn't pull away. His fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket, knuckles white. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters like an impatient visitor. John glanced at the window. Nothing but darkness. Still, the feeling gnawed at him, someone had left that boy to die, and they wouldn't take kindly to him being saved. The boy finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They will come." The word sent a chill down John's spine. Not because of what was said, but how it was said, like a fact, simple and unshakable. "Who?" John asked, leaning closer. The boy's gaze dropped to the floor. Silence. John sighed. He'd known Apaches to be stubborn, but this was something else. This was fear. He left the boy by the fire and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. The moon hung low, painting the prairie in shades of silver and black. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for movement. Nothing. But the unease stayed. He walked to where he'd found the boy, the ground still scuffed from where he'd cut him down. Kneeling, he ran his fingers over the dirt. A glint of metal caught his eye, a button, half buried in the dust. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm. Brass, with an eagle stamped on it. Army issue. His jaw tightened. Soldiers. Here. The nearest fort was 2 days' ride, and they had no business stringing up Apache boys. Unless it wasn't about the boy at all. Back inside, the boy was exactly where he'd left him, but his posture had changed. He sat straighter, his dark eyes locked onto John with an intensity that hadn't been there before. "You are not like them," he said suddenly. John paused. "Like who?" The boy hesitated, then reached into the folds of his tattered shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch. He held it out, his hand shaking slightly. "For you." John took it, the leather warm from the boy's skin. Inside was a single arrowhead, its edges sharp, its surface etched with strange, swirling marks. "What is this?" he asked. The boy's voice dropped even lower. "A warning." Before John could ask more, the boy's head snapped toward the window. His body went rigid. "They are here." A second later, John heard it too, the distant sound of hoofbeats, growing louder. The hoofbeats grew louder, pounding against the hard earth like war drums in the night. John moved quickly, snuffing out the lantern with a hiss of oil smoke. Darkness swallowed the room whole, broken only by the faint orange glow of dying embers in the fireplace. The boy didn't make a sound, but John could feel the tension radiating from his small frame like heat from a branding iron. Through the cracked shutter slats, John watched as 3 riders materialized from the gloom, their silhouettes black against the moon-washed prairie. The lead man dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on solid ground, his spurs jingling like a rattlesnake's warning as he approached the porch. John's fingers brushed against the worn grip of his revolver, but he didn't draw. Not yet. The man stopped just short of the steps, his face still hidden in shadow. "Mercer," he called out, voice rough as gravel, "we know you got him." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken threats. Behind him, the other 2 riders shifted in their saddles, hands resting conspicuously near their gun belts. The boy's breathing had gone so quiet John had to glance back to make sure he was still there. Those dark eyes were wide now, not with fear, but something sharper, recognition. The lead man took another step forward, and the moonlight finally revealed his face. John's gut clenched. Sam Coulter. They'd ridden together years back, before the war turned neighbors against each other. The scar running from Coulter's left eyebrow down to his jawline was new, pale and puckered against his sun-leathered skin. "That boy's stolen property, John," Coulter said, spreading his hands in a mockery of peace. "Just hand him over and we'll ride out. No need for this to get ugly." The lie was so thick John could almost taste it in the air, metallic like blood. From the corner of his eye, John saw the boy's hand slip into his shirt where the strange arrowhead lay hidden. The movement was slight, but Coulter's gaze snapped to it like a hawk spotting prey. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "So he still has it," he murmured, more to himself than to John. The other riders exchanged glances, their hands now openly resting on their pistols. The night air grew thick, pressing against John's skin like a coming storm. Then the boy did something unexpected. He stepped forward, putting himself between John and the door. "You want the stone," he said, his voice steadier than it had been all night. "But it is not yours to take." Coulter's smile vanished. For the first time, John saw real anger flash in the man's eyes, quick and dangerous as lightning. "That's where you're wrong, boy," he spat. "Everything in this territory belongs to whoever's strong enough to take it." His hand dropped to his gun, fingers flexing. John moved without thinking, his body blocking the boy from view. "You'll have to go through me first, Sam," he said quietly. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Coulter studied him for a long moment, then chuckled darkly. "Always the hero, ain't you, Mercer?" He took a deliberate step back, hands raised in mock surrender. "All right. We'll do this your way, for now. But mark my words, that boy's carrying death with him. You keep him close, you're signing your own death warrant." With that, he turned on his heel and mounted up, his men following suit. As the riders disappeared into the night, John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The boy was trembling again, but when John turned to him, he saw something new in those dark eyes, not just fear, but determination. "They will come back," the boy whispered. "With more men." John nodded, his mind racing. That arrowhead meant something, something big enough to send Coulter riding out in the middle of the night. And whatever it was, John had just staked his life on protecting it. The boy reached into his shirt once more and pulled out the leather pouch. This time, he emptied its contents into his palm. The arrowhead gleamed dully in the firelight, but now John could see it wasn't just any stone, it was half of something larger, the broken edge clean and sharp. The boy turned it over to reveal strange markings carved into its surface, symbols that looked nothing like any Apache design John had ever seen. "What is this?" John asked, reaching out but not quite touching it. The boy's fingers closed around it protectively. "The key," he said simply. "To the place where the earth bleeds silver." The boy's fever came on fast. One moment he was staring at the arrowhead with those 2 knowing eyes, the next he was shaking beneath the blankets, his skin burning to the touch. John soaked a rag in cool water from the basin and pressed it to the boy's forehead, but it did little to ease the heat rolling off him in waves. The boy's lips moved soundlessly. The boy's fever came on fast. One moment he was staring at the arrowhead with those two knowing eyes, the next he was shaking beneath the blankets, his skin burning to the touch. John soaked a rag in cool water from the basin and pressed it to the boy's forehead, but it did little to ease the heat rolling off him in waves. The boy's lips moved soundlessly, his fingers twitching like he was reaching for something only he could see. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, his eyes flew open, glassy with sickness but sharp with urgency. "They're digging," he gasped, his voice raw. "They're waking it up." John leaned closer. "Waking what up?" The boy's hand shot out and gripped John's wrist with surprising strength. "The giant," he whispered. Then his eyes rolled back, and he went limp, his breathing shallow but steady. John sat back on his heels, unease coiling in his gut. He'd heard stories, of course. Every rancher within 50 miles knew the Apache tales of the sleeping giant beneath the mountains, some ancient spirit said to guard the land. Most white men dismissed it as superstition, but the way the boy had said it, like it was real, like it was already stirring. He stood and paced to the window, the arrowhead heavy in his pocket. Outside, the moon hung fat and bright, casting long shadows across the yard. On impulse, he pulled the stone from his pocket and held it up to the pale light. The markings he'd barely noticed before now seemed to shift under the moon's glow, lines connecting in ways that made his breath catch. It wasn't just symbols, it was a map. Faint but unmistakable, the lines traced the shape of the canyon walls east of his property, with a single, deliberate mark near the base where the old Spanish mine had collapsed decades ago. A floorboard creaked behind him. John whirled, hand going to his gun, but it was only the boy, sitting up despite his fever, watching him with an eerie calm. "You see it now," the boy murmured. John nodded slowly. "This leads to the silver." The boy's expression darkened. "To death," he corrected. "The silver is its blood. To take it is to wake the giant." He swayed slightly, and John moved to steady him, but the boy pushed his hands away. "There's more," he insisted, his voice gaining strength despite his trembling limbs. "The white men, they have the other half. They're close." John's mind raced. Coulter hadn't just been after the boy, he'd been after the other piece of the key. And if they were already digging near the canyon? He didn't get to finish the thought. A sound cut through the night, distant but unmistakable, the sharp crack of dynamite. Then another. The boy's head snapped toward the noise, his face going ashen. "Too late," he breathed. John didn't wait. He grabbed his rifle and a canteen, then tossed the boy his coat. "We're going." The boy didn't argue, just pulled the coat on with stiff fingers and followed John out into the night. The horses were skittish, their ears pinned back at the distant booms still echoing through the hills. John helped the boy onto the mare, then swung up onto his own gelding. They rode hard, the cold air biting at their faces as the land rose steadily toward the canyon. They crested the ridge just as the third explosion lit up the night, the flash illuminating the figures below like ghosts in the sudden light. Men swarmed the canyon floor, their shadows grotesque and elongated against the rocks as they hauled debris from a freshly blown opening in the cliff face. John counted at least a dozen, maybe more. And there, directing them with sharp gestures, was Coulter, his scarred face twisted in triumph as he held something aloft, a glint of metal catching the firelight. The other half of the key. The boy made a strangled noise beside him. "They found the door," he said, voice thick with dread. John followed his gaze to the cliff, where the explosions had exposed what looked like an ancient, carved archway, half buried in rubble. Even from this distance, John could see the strange markings matching those on the arrowhead. But something was wrong. The men below were shouting now, their voices carrying up the ridge in panicked bursts. A few stumbled back from the opening, pointing wildly. Then John saw it, a deep, shuddering crack spreading through the ground like a spider's web, starting at the archway and racing toward the men. The earth itself seemed to groan, the ground beneath them shuddered like a living thing, a deep, groaning vibration that traveled up through the horse's legs and into John's bones. The mare whinnied in terror, dancing sideways as dust plumed from the canyon below. The boy clutched the saddle horn, his face pale but his eyes locked on the chaos unfolding beneath them. The men around the archway were scattering now, their shouts rising into panicked screams as the crack in the earth widened with a sound like tearing fabric. One of the miners stumbled too close to the edge, the ground gave way beneath him with a sickening lurch, and then he was gone, swallowed without even time to scream. Coulter stood frozen, the two halves of the key now joined in his hands, his mouth moving but no words coming out. The assembled key glowed faintly in the moonlight, the strange symbols pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Then the earth heaved again, this time with such force that John's gelding reared, nearly throwing him. He grabbed for the reins just as a new sound split the night, not an explosion, not crumbling rock, but something deeper. A breath. The boy gasped, his hands flying to his ears. "It's singing," he choked out, his voice barely audible over the growing rumble. John didn't hear any song, just the awful creaking of stone and the distant screams of men, but the boy's face twisted in pain, blood beginning to trickle from his nose. Above the canyon, the stars seemed to waver, as if seen through rising heat. Then the archway collapsed inward, not in a shower of rubble, but with an eerie precision, like a door being opened rather than broken. The darkness beyond was too deep, too complete, swallowing the torchlight whole. One of the surviving miners turned to run, his boots slipping in the loose shale. He didn't make it 3 steps before the ground beneath him bulged upward, sending him sprawling. Then the earth parted. Not a collapse, not a landslide, but a deliberate, smooth motion, like a hand pushing up through sand. Something pale and glistening emerged, not rock, not metal, but something in between, its surface catching the moonlight in strange, oily ripples. It rose until it stood taller than a man, then stopped, quivering. The boy made a strangled noise beside John. "Its finger," he whispered. Then the screaming started in earnest. The pale thing moved faster than anything that size should, whipping forward with terrifying precision. It caught the nearest miner around the waist, lifting him kicking into the air. The man's shouts cut off abruptly as the thing contracted, a wet crunch, then silence. The other men broke, running in all directions, but the ground itself seemed to turn against them, shifting and buckling to block their escape. Coulter alone remained standing by the ruined archway, his face slack with horror, the joined key still clutched in his hands. John didn't realize he'd drawn his rifle until he felt the stock against his shoulder. He sighted down the barrel at Coulter, not sure what he meant to do, shoot the key from his hands. Shoot the man himself, when the boy grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "No," he said, his voice steadier than it had been all night. "It's too late for that." His dark eyes reflected the chaos below, but his grip was firm. "We need the shaman." Another tremor shook the ridge, sending a rain of pebbles clattering around them. In the canyon, the pale appendage retracted, dragging its limp burden back toward the pit. More of the glistening material was emerging now, curling up from the broken earth like the legs of some monstrous insect. Coulter finally seemed to snap out of his daze. He turned to run, but the key in his hands flared suddenly, so bright it cast sharp shadows across the canyon walls. The man froze mid-step, his body rigid, his mouth open in a soundless scream. Then, slowly, against his obvious will, he turned back toward the archway, his legs moving like a marionette's. Step by terrible step, he walked into the darkness. The last thing John saw before the earth sealed itself with a final, shuddering groan was Coulter's face, his mouth moving in what might have been a prayer or a curse, the glowing key held out before him like an offering. Then silence. The canyon floor lay still, scattered with abandoned tools and hats, the only evidence that anyone had ever been there. Even the cracks in the earth had closed, leaving smooth stone where moments before there had been yawning gaps. The boy slumped forward in the saddle, his breathing ragged. "It's sleeping again," he murmured. "For now." John opened his mouth to reply when a new sound reached them, hoofbeats, but not from the direction of the canyon. From the east, where the old Apache trails wound through the hills. A single rider approached at a steady pace, their silhouette slim and straight in the saddle. As they drew closer, moonlight glinted off silver hair beneath a worn shawl. An old woman, her face lined like canyon rock, her eyes sharp as flint. The boy straightened with a quiet gasp. "Grandmother," he breathed. The old woman rode toward them with the slow certainty of a vulture circling a dying thing, her horse picking its way across the uneven ground without guidance. Moonlight caught the silver streaks in her braided hair, making them gleam like metal, and the lines on her face seemed to carve deeper shadows with every yard she closed between them. The boy straightened in his saddle, his breath quickening, but he didn't speak. John kept his hand near his rifle, though something in the woman's steady gaze told him it wouldn't matter if he drew it. She stopped her horse an arm's length away and studied them both in silence, her dark eyes lingering longest on the boy's blood-streaked face. When she finally spoke, her voice was dry as sun-baked clay. "You cut him down from the tree." It wasn't a question. John nodded once. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Foolish," she said, though her tone held no malice. "But perhaps meant to be." She turned her attention fully to the boy, reaching out to grip his chin with fingers like leathery talons. She tilted his face toward the moonlight, examining his eyes with a focus that made John's skin prickle. Whatever she saw there made her exhale sharply through her nose. "The song is in you now," she murmured, more to herself than to them. "Stronger than I feared." The boy swallowed hard but didn't pull away. "I tried not to listen," he whispered. The shaman's expression softened, just for a moment. "Some ears cannot help but hear, little hawk." She released him and turned her horse toward the canyon, where the last traces of dust still hung in the air. "Come. We have little time before the white men return with worse than dynamite." She nudged her mount forward without waiting to see if they followed. John exchanged a glance with the boy. Little Hawk, the shaman had called him, but the boy just urged his mare after the old woman, his shoulders set with a determination that belied his feverish trembling. John followed, his mind racing. The canyon looked eerily undisturbed now, no sign of the men or the thing that had taken them. Only the scattered tools and a single, half-buried boot gave any hint of what had transpired. The shaman dismounted near the collapsed archway and knelt, pressing her palm flat against the stone. She closed her eyes, her lips moving silently. After a long moment, she stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. "It sleeps again," she said. "For a little while." John finally found his voice. "What is it?" The shaman studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he deserved an answer. "You would call it a demon," she said at last. "We call it Hastian Collegii, the buried man. It was here long before my people, long before yours. The first shamans bound it beneath the earth with songs and silver, with blood and bone." She nodded toward the boy. "His ancestors were among them. The binding runs in his veins, as it ran in his father's." John frowned. "Then why did it wake now?" The shaman's mouth twisted. "Because your people are greedy. They found the first key, the one my grandson carried, and thought it led to treasure. They did not understand that some doors should stay closed." She turned to Little Hawk, her expression grim. "But the song is weak now. The buried man hears it, but not clearly. That is why it took the one who carried the other half of the key, to hear better." A cold understanding settled over John. Coulter hadn't just been dragged into the earth, he'd become part of whatever ancient horror lay beneath it. The boy, Little Hawk, made a soft noise beside him, his hand pressed to his temple like something pained him. The shaman noticed immediately. "You hear it now," she said, not a question. The boy nodded miserably. "It's whispering." The shaman's jaw tightened. "Then we must act before it learns to sing again." She reached into the folds of her shawl and withdrew a small leather bundle, similar to the one that had held the arrowhead but older, its edges worn smooth with time. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a knife with a blade of black stone and a hilt wrapped in faded red cloth. "This was your father's," she said to Little Hawk, holding it out. "It carries his blood, and his song. With it, you can silence the buried man, for good." The boy reached for the knife but hesitated, his fingers hovering just above the blade. "How?" The shaman's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "You must go where the white men dug. You must cut the thread that binds it to this world." She turned to John. "And you must protect him while he does." John opened his mouth to ask how exactly he was supposed to protect the boy from something that swallowed men whole, but the shaman was already moving back toward her horse. "Wait," he called after her. "You're not coming with us." She paused, one foot in the stirrup. "My part in this is done," she said simply. "The song does not answer to me as it does to him." She swung up into the saddle with a grace that belied her age. Before John could protest further, she fixed him with a look that made his blood run cold. "Know this, rancher, if my grandson fails, the buried man will wake fully. And when it does, it will not stop at this canyon." She nodded toward the distant glow of John's ranch house on the horizon. "It will take everything in its path." With that, she turned her horse and rode into the night, leaving them standing at the edge of the abyss. The earth beneath John's boots felt different now, warmer, almost breathing. Little Hawk swayed beside him, his father's obsidian knife clutched tight in his trembling hand. The canyon walls loomed over them, the collapsed archway a jagged maw of shadows. Somewhere deep below, the buried man stirred, its whispers slithering up through the cracks in the stone. John tightened his grip on his rifle, though he knew bullets wouldn't save them now. "Ready?" he asked the boy. Little Hawk didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the darkness ahead, his lips moving silently along with the whispers only he could hear. Then, without warning, he lurched forward, stumbling toward the archway like a man in a trance. John cursed and followed, the heat rising as they neared the entrance. The air smelled of wet stone and something older, copper and burnt hair. The tunnel beyond was narrow, the walls slick with moisture that glistened unnaturally in the dim light of John's lantern. The deeper they went, the louder the whispers became, until even John could hear them, not words, but a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated in his teeth. Little Hawk moved faster now, driven by something beyond fear. Then the tunnel opened abruptly into a cavern so vast the lantern light couldn't reach the ceiling. And there, coiled in the center like a great serpent, was the buried man. It wasn't a man at all. Pale, sinewy tendrils pulsed beneath a translucent membrane, their length studded with jagged bits of silver and bone. At its core, half embedded in the creature's mass, was Coulter, or what was left of him. His face stretched grotesquely across the entity's surface, his mouth moving in time with the whispers. When he saw them, his eyes, now too large, too black, widened in recognition. "You," he rasped, his voice no longer entirely human. "You brought the knife." Little Hawk stepped forward, the blade glinting in his hand. "This ends now," he said, his voice steadier than it had been in days. Coulter's face twisted. "Foolish boy. You think you can kill a god?" "Not a god," Little Hawk said. "Just a thief." And with that, he drove the knife into the nearest tendril. The reaction was instantaneous. The cavern shook, dust raining from above as the creature shrieked, a sound like tearing metal. The tendrils lashed wildly, one catching John across the chest and sending him sprawling. Coulter's face contorted in agony, his form melting further into the creature's mass. "You don't understand," he screamed. "It promised power." Little Hawk didn't hesitate. He wrenched the knife free and plunged it deeper, into the heart of the silver-streaked core. "And my father promised this," he whispered. A final, shuddering groan filled the cavern. Then, with a sound like a sigh, the buried man stilled. The tendrils went slack, the silver veins dulling to gray. Coulter's face sagged, his features dissolving like sand in water. Then, slowly, the entire creature began to crumble, its body collapsing inward until nothing remained but dust and the faint, fading echo of its song. Silence. John dragged himself upright, wincing at the pain in his ribs. Little Hawk stood motionless, the knife loose in his grip, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Outside, the first light of dawn painted the canyon walls in pale gold. It was over. Moral lesson. Greed digs its own grave. The earth remembers what men forget, some doors should never be opened, and some treasures cost more than silver. True strength lies not in taking, but in protecting, not in waking demons, but in letting them sleep. Epilogue. A month later, John stood on his porch, watching as Little Hawk saddled his horse. The boy, no, the young man now, had regained his strength, though his eyes were older than they'd been before. "You sure you won't stay?" John asked, though he already knew the answer. Little Hawk shook his head. The shaman was right. The song is in me now. I have to make sure others don't try to wake what's left. He patted his saddlebag, where the obsidian knife lay wrapped in deer hide. John nodded. He'd expected as much. Then ride safe. Little Hawk mounted up, pausing just once to glance back at the canyon in the distance. Then he turned his horse east, toward the rising sun, and rode out of John's life as quietly as he'd entered it. And the earth, at last, was still.